Okay. Welcome to the Environmental Law Monitor. I'm your host, Daniel Pope. This podcast is brought to you by Bracewell LLP. And we're glad you're here with us. One of the things that we have wanted to do with our podcast is to branch out and explore some areas that relate to environmental and natural resources law. And so I'm joined today by two of our colleagues who are going to help us explore cybersecurity issues as it might relate to operations at facilities. And they're going to walk us through some of the developments. Obviously, we've been hearing about the Colonial Pipeline hack, that ransomware incident, and there have been some others that relate to environmental law issues as well. So we're going to explore some of that. I'm joined today by Seth DuCharme, a partner in our New York office, and Phil Bezanson, a partner in our Seattle office. So this is our first coast-to-coast podcast on the Environmental Law Monitor. Thank you guys for being with us. I would love for you to, starting with you, Seth, just give a little bit of your background, share what you've done in the cybersecurity world since you may be introducing yourself to some of our listeners for the first time.
Sure. Thanks very much, Dan. It's really a pleasure to be on the podcast today with you and Phil. So I joined Bracewell back in May after having spent about 18 years on and off with the U.S. government in various positions. And a large portion of that time was spent in understanding and trying to navigate and operate in the cyber environment. I mean, this is an environmental podcast. Cyber is an environment. And I think it's important for listeners to conceptualize it that way. There are legal aspects of that environment, technical aspects, and lots of different stakeholders and players. So the team that I played on for the longest before joining Bracewell was, with the Justice Department in various capacities. I left as the acting U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of New York across the bridge in Brooklyn, which had a busy cyber practice and had been the chief of the National Security and Cyber section there for a number of years, including when we first stood it up in 2012. And then prior to serving as the acting U.S. attorney, I'd been down in D.C. as the principal associate deputy attorney general, where all of the Justice Department's components sort of fell under the deputy attorney general's purview. And I advised the deputy attorney general on matters including cyber initiatives, cyber policy, coordinating with other components of the U.S. government to really shape the environment in a way that would be favorable for those we were supposed to protect, and a more challenging environment for bad actors to operate in. To be blunt, it's a difficult environment to be successful in. I don't want to get too far ahead and into the meat of our conversation, but my conversation today is informed primarily from my time as the chief of the National Security and Cybercrime section when we were investigating criminal activity, which included everything from what you might imagine as the adolescent in the basement who was up to mischief, right, all the way up to foreign state actors and those who they supported as they pillaged all of the industries and individuals that we were trying to protect. So in 2012, we were pretty clumsy. I'll be blunt. I think we're less clumsy now, both on the private side and how we deal with cyber incident response. And I think the government has come a long way as well. And I think that Phil certainly has done a lot along the way to find where there are alignments between a client who's preparing for an incident and how you work with the government, to make sure you can mitigate harms that come to you, and you can maximize your potential, essentially, to pursue the bad guys and protect, the things that you're entrusted with. So, I've recently joined Bracewell, but I'm hoping to take that experience with government, to work with partners and our clients to help them find alignment with U.S. government components who are, as you know, a big player in this landscape.
And that makes a lot of sense. Just kind of what you just said about there being such a presence from foreign state actors as well. A private company may be dealing not just with the 35-year-old basement dwelling hacker, but something a little bit more nefarious and organized and intentional and targeted. Phil, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit to our guests as well? And Phil is one of the co-hosts of our Sidebar podcast, so you should definitely check that out. It's a high quality but slightly inferior podcast.
Wow, that's how you want to introduce me. That's how you want to make me look good for your podcast. Thanks, Dan. I also want to raise an issue with the repeated criticism of folks doing work while sitting in their basements, because I'm sitting here in my basement recording room, and I feel like you guys are taking pot shots at me already. But that's fine.
Seth's also going to have to referee between us. I think it's entirely possible that this podcast just evolves into us arguing about whether, historically speaking, it's been Seattle or Austin that's had the more influential music scene.
Then we're going to need to do like a double episode or something, because okay. I can go on for a long time about that.
That's true.
So I do thank you for having me here, for having both Seth and me here to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fun to visit with you guys.
Seth and I sort of developed our experiences and interests and learning about cybersecurity matters to some degree kind of on parallel tracks. That while Seth was working with the Department of Justice and other folks in the government, I joined Bracewell in March of 2006. So I've been with the firm for quite a while now, primarily working in government investigations and enforcement and other kind of white collar related matters. And, no surprise, over the last few years, in particular, the experience of interfacing with government as someone representing companies, the experience of working in incident responses of all stripes representing companies, that has led to doing a lot of work in the cybersecurity world, whether that's working with companies at the very beginning to help develop incident response plans, to helping companies translate the risk work that they've done and the successes that they've had in the cyber defense space to their senior management or boards of directors, cybersecurity risk disclosures, and then, of course, actual incident response, whether it's phishing or email compromise or ransomware or, denial of service kind of attacks. The last few years have really seen an expansion of the kinds of harm that hackers can cause beyond simply taking, a customer's credit card number and running around and charging up lots of expenses for buying fancy things, to really much more macro harmful things that, as Dan, you mentioned, things like the Colonial Pipeline hack and certainly other recent hacks like in Oldsmar, Florida, that really do raise a specter of serious environmental risk and certainly plenty of other risks.
Yeah, and maybe let's pivot to those hacks. I mean, the two that I think about, and these are two that relate to environmental issues and the way that I think about them and what I do. Obviously, the Colonial Pipeline hack, and that was a ransomware attack where they just, if I understand that correctly, they basically locked people out of the system and demanded a payment to grant access back. Is that right?
Yeah, and one of the things that I think really, really, really is important to understand about the Colonial Pipeline hack is that the components of Colonial's systems that were encrypted by the ransomware attackers were not the components of their systems that actually governed pipeline operations.
Okay.
The components of their systems that were encrypted were really kind of administrative payment processing components of their system. And that, as I understand it, this is based on some of the things that have been reported and things that have come out in the days since that attack, that really the company acted out of an abundance of caution in dealing with incomplete information, in responding to a dramatic set of circumstances, to be super, super careful which makes a lot of sense. But I think the important item that gets lost in a lot of the drama around the Colonial Pipeline ransomware incident is that there wasn't really any evidence that there was a real harm or threat that hackers had tapped into what are typically incredibly secure pipeline operations, servers, and the like, and that there was not, from what I could tell, much risk of hackers sitting in Russia unleashing, tidal waves of whatever the pipelines were carrying into the landscape of the, I-95 corridor.
Right. So there wasn't a huge release risk.
Correct. Yeah, I don't think there was.
Okay. And then you also mentioned the Oldsmore, Florida hack, and this was kind of interesting. It was different from a ransomware attack. An individual gained access to water quality treatment facilities, internal systems, and increased the amount of lye going in to a public water system. Fortunately, somebody caught it pretty quickly, but somebody had really increased the amount of lye that was supposed to be going into that water by, I think, 1,000% or something really significant.
Honestly, we've seen between the Colonial Pipeline and SolarWinds and Microsoft some very large scale household type name hacks over the last 6 months. But I think the Oldsmar, Florida one is the scariest of the lot, because you have this sort of fairly out of the way corner that's not going to have the most sophisticated, most robust, aggressive cybersecurity defense systems in place. Hackers were able to gain access through Teams screen sharing application where there was a shared password. No one updated the password. It was really easy to get in. The only reason it was caught, from what we can tell, is that there was actually a water quality related employee sitting in front of his screen who actually saw the levels getting adjusted by someone other than him, and had the wherewithal to say, wait a second, this isn't right.
Normal.
This shouldn't be happening. And it saved the day, which is a great fail-safe success story. But also, if you think of the order of operations for things that have to go wrong to get to the point where you're relying on one person sitting in front of a computer screen and actually watching safety levels, like that's kind of unnerving.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, thinking about some of your comments, Phil, and maybe, to the point of this podcast, understanding and being able to triage what the direct consequences of the ransomware attack or the hack will be, and the collateral consequences, I think, is really so critically important to mitigating, all of the types of harm that can arise. And when you have a conversation like this, and you can get, people talking about and thinking about, for example, what does it mean if data is seized, but that data has no connection to operational control? Then that goes to how scared should you be? And I think with Colonial, and certainly, some other ransomware attacks we've seen, it's those collateral consequences based on a misperception of what's happening in the ransomware attack or seizure that can really cause the most problems. And, having as many conversations as you can ahead of time so that, all of the stakeholders and the general public, frankly, can better understand how to assess how dangerous is this situation, to me personally, or to some equity that I hold, because the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, as Phil points out, there was no reason that I should rush to the gas station, with my 5-gallon cans, because of that ransomware attack. And, events like that, I mean, our adversaries, both small and large, sit back and watch that, right? And you can imagine if you were a foreign state actor, hostile to the United States, and you watch very closely. Okay, so we seize the data, of a pipeline company, and then we watch people panic and make these runs, on the pump. My goodness, how easy it is to cause, such wide-ranging mischief here. And then, conversely, if you do have loss of operational control over something, how quickly And effectively, can the victim of that attack communicate with all the people, who need to know so that the harm, can truly be mitigated? So I think communication, as in most practice areas, communication is so critical to understanding how to prepare for, mitigate and recover from cyber incidents of all kinds. And the more conversations we can have ahead of time, the easier it will be, during that incident to get the right information to the right people so that all of, the stakeholders, including the general public, can make responsible and reasonable decisions about how they're going to change their behavior. And I would say that's on the front end too. I mean, a lot of the cyber incidents are, and the harm that arises from them are caused from, human behavior responses. And for years now, people have been talking about cyber hygiene and practicing good cyber habits. And most of that boils down, at the end of most 90-minute PowerPoints end with like, don't click on links, and we've all heard that by now. But what else does that mean? What else does it mean to have good cyber hygiene? And how much is a reasonable amount of time and energy and resources to invest in making sure that people change their habits and keep up those good habits as the threat landscape evolves? It's hard to get people to change their habits. I mean, just walking through Times Square a few blocks from our building, I could say to a tourist who was coming in, put your wallet in your front pocket and you're less likely to have your pocket picked when you walk through Times Square. And most
really,
people
that's
won't.
the only hygiene recommendation you have walking through Times Square?
Well, I mean, I won't even get to the naked cowboy, which I think is where you're probably headed, Phil. But I'm saying, you could give somebody a roadmap to security, right? It's always going to be balanced. Like security, it's always going to be a balance between how much of a hassle do I want to make this? How much freedom am I willing to give up, and how much comfort am I willing to give up to some degree? And in order to make a good decision about that, you really have to understand, well, what's this really going to cost me if I screw up? If I have a billfold in my pocket and one credit card and I lose $100 in cash and a Visa because I left it in an easy access pocket in Times Square, well, okay, I can cancel that credit card and maybe that's the cost of doing business for a little comfort. But if if you lose operational control of your company, and that's a company that's involved in critical infrastructure for the United States, that's not easily mitigated. And so it's finding somewhere on an individual level, on a corporate level, what habits, what are the good habits that are going to protect you on the front end? And do you know enough about what your situation is likely to be that you can communicate in real time with all the people, who need to know about it? I would say enjoy your time in Times Square, but when you get home, make sure those good habits are gonna carry the day.
So I think it's fascinating, Seth and Phil. You've kind of pointed out, I think, a key part of the two different cyber attacks we're talking about. With the Oldsmar facility, that's a very intentional action to cause a certain kind of release, a certain kind of disruption to that public water supply's operations. What I think is fascinating about what y'all are talking about with the Colonial ransomware attack is that it's as much the attack, it's as much our response to that attack and the thought processes that we have that would shape the decisions that we're making about operations as much as it is the attack itself, right? So you lose the ability to access equipment, but that's not actually connected to pipeline operations, and we're not very worried about the threat of a release to the environment. But that ransomware attack is making us still think about those kinds of issues. So that takes us naturally to, what are some things you can do on the front end to anticipate or prepare for certain kinds of disruptions like that? And then what are some of the best things you can do in responding to that to make sure that, you've mentioned, Seth, the importance of having frequent conversations about this topic. But let's drill down in that a little bit more. What are some steps people can take proactively to make this more real, whether that's at a large production facility or a smaller distribution facility, whatever the case may be?
One of the things that I think that's historically been common in, most industrial segments of the business world is, having things like incident simulation, tabletop kind of exercises, going through, okay, what happens if there's an oil spill here? What happens if there's an explosion at this, refining facility? And let's walk through the steps. Who do we call?
Process safety,
what happens? Yeah,
occupational
all the process,
safety.
All of that stuff. I mean, the same exact concepts apply to any number of different cybersecurity kind of incidents. It's figuring out, to Seth's point, who's on the team, who needs to be communicating with whom, who are the real decision makers, and how do we anticipate for different things to go wrong? And, you go through your tabletop exercise and then, someone throws in a curveball. It's like, okay, all of a sudden now there's a huge thunderstorm and rain is pelting down heavily. What does that mean for this chemical release? Okay, react, respond. Who do we need to call? What different levers need to be pulled? Who else needs to be brought into this? The same concepts apply with a cyber attack where it's like, okay, a virus has been detected on a server that deals with HR matters. All right. What does that entail? What needs to be locked down? If we lock down this server, what are the ripple effects of other components of the company that may not function? Wait a second. If the HR server is locked down, does that mean all of our employees with keycard access or thumbprint access to buildings won't be able to get into buildings or get into certain parts of the building because there's some component of the security server that's tied in with the HR server where the biometric information lives? Going through that kind of thing and just getting in your reps. It's like any other, exercise or, practice for a competition or practice for an oral argument. It's, practice and seeing how you do with surprises.
Yeah. And I think, Phil makes an excellent point that look, if it wasn't, quote, regular practice 10 years ago, 10 years ago, you could maybe get away with, oh, this is also mystifying to me. I'm not a computer geek. I don't know much about cyber. You could expect a little bit more forgiveness 10 years ago for not practicing. I think those days are over. That's been made clear. The administration has made it a priority. It's in the media every day. The expectations of stakeholders and the general public are higher now. You can't get away with saying, "Oh, I'm not a cyber geek. That's not my thing." The expectation is that everybody's going to have a basic level of understanding about this, and the more responsibility you have in a corporation, I think the higher expectations there are going to be that you know enough about it to be functional. And the only way to have confidence that you know enough about it to be functional is to do exactly what Phil said, which is to pressure test it and to pressure test it regularly, because the landscape evolves. Your tabletop exercise from 2 years ago may no longer, demonstrate your command of industry standards and best practices in the ransomware or cybersecurity environment, because that landscape is changing. So you might not like this stuff. You might not, proudly declare yourself a cyber geek, but like many of the things that we have to be good at to be viable and functional and withstand, the stress and the pressure and the potential threats to operations. Everyone at this point is on notice that this is something that, cybersecurity is something that you just have to have a basic cultural competency in.
And it seems like EHS professionals need to be wrapped up in those tabletop reviews, at least now. Maybe 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, when it was just sort of a grab and run with credit card information or something like that, would have been pretty easy to say, yeah, we don't need to have somebody from the EHS world running through this tabletop with us. Yeah. That's not really that important. But maybe after Colonial, maybe after Oldsmar, EHS professionals need to be kind of kicking that door in a little bit and saying, hey, we're part of this conversation too, even if we've been thinking ahead of time that our systems are secure. We don't connect everything to the internet, for example. They still need to be part of that conversation.
I think that's right. And just to draw on some of the experiences I had with the sort of the national security crises we dealt with in the department, when you have somebody under attack in any form, there's immediately going to be a heavy demand for information from a number of different places. And people who have ultimate responsibility to both know the facts and communicate the facts in a cyber incident response are going to be under a tremendous amount of pressure. And because the true cyber geeks and the tech experts, are going to be probably the only ones who can understand in real time what's happening and how to evaluate it, a lot of that pressure is going to be pushed down on them in that moment. Lots of calls for information. What's happening? Where are we? Is this real? How far does it go? And then there's going to be a desire to want to communicate quickly. But if you're wrong, right, then you do more harm than good. You lose credibility with all the stakeholders. You may compound the damage. So part of what you're preparing for is to understand ahead of time, how do I communicate with my tech people in-house and maybe, third-party consultants that we bring in? How do I communicate with them? How can I prime my brain ahead of time so that within my area of responsibility, I don't overwhelm them with demands? I got to let them do their job, right, to identify and solve the problem. But I've got to also do my part, to understand what they tell me, so that then I can remessage it, likely paraphrase it for non-tech, stakeholders or investigators or regulators or internal or external, people who have a need to know. And so the more conversation we can have like this on the front end, and that's a big part of what, Phil does with our clients, is go through these incident response plans and read them and just, sit in the position of somebody else other than a lawyer who has this as a subject matter expertise, but it's stand in the shoes of all the other women and men who are going to have an interest in this, and can they understand this plan, and is this plan likely to withstand contact with the enemy? And is it likely to be executable, in real time? And if not, let's do more of that pressure testing and let's do more of that preparation on the front end. And then the upside is, you come through an experience like that, and then ideally you feel more confident in your plan. You feel less anxious about the bad thing happening because you've lived through some version of it. And if you practice it enough, the inoculation to that stress inevitably allows you to perform, better and with more confidence.
That you touched on something that I think is really important that gets left out of a lot of incident response assessments, cyber or otherwise. And that's really figuring out the full range of stakeholders, that it's not just government or regulatory. There are countless other non-legal required stakeholders that should be built into cybersecurity incident response plans. I think the thing that's getting a fair amount of attention right now, at least in the cybersecurity / government investigations world, is the very, very broad, shall we say, request for information that the SEC put out a few weeks ago to all current former customers of SolarWinds, seeking information about the customers' interactions with SolarWinds, among other things, in response to the SolarWinds breach in December 2019. 2020. And that's a meaningful, obviously, commercial consideration for SolarWinds, that now the SEC has reached out to thousands of other entities and asked about what kind of communications they had with SolarWinds around the time of the breach. So if you think about any organization that's subject to a cyber attack, saying, okay, here are the people who we need to talk to right now. Typically, that list is, okay, who in government can maybe help us with defeating or defending against the attack? Who in government are we legally required to notify, and when? Who else within the company are we legally required to notify, and when? Whether that's people who are more senior or people who are employees who have had personal information affected. But it's not always first top of mind. Wait a second. Who are our commercial partners? Who are our customers? Who are the people who we rely on for our business to make money? When do we reach out to them? How do we reach out to them? Do we do it in a cautious, careful, wait and see way till you solve the problem? Do you do it right away and reach out with incomplete information? I mean, these are all very different approaches depending on the circumstances, but there's certainly things that merit, a great deal of anticipation and discussion beforehand.
Seems like that there's just no way to adequately respond to a cyber incident without significant anticipation and significant preparatory work, developing a playbook, as it were. And, we didn't even get into one of the things I thought we might talk about today, which is, we mentioned ransomware, and then I'm not sure exactly what you would call the Oldsmar attack, just kind of malicious interference with system operations, but that's too clunky of a word to get used repeatedly in the cyber world. But you mentioned denial of service. You mentioned a few other types of attacks. There's just a huge range, and it seems like new tactics and strategies get developed every year. And so taking the time on the front end to not only learn about what those types of attacks could be, but then how to respond to different types of attacks in ways that protect your company's operations or its data or whatever it is, seems just absolutely crucial, so that when you actually are dealing with an incident, God forbid, but this happens and it happens with increasing frequency, it seems like it really is an attack, right? You are playing defense and you need to have thought through what some of your moves could be to just avoid being totally on the back heel.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that Seth mentioned a few minutes ago that I think is super important right now for how people think about this and how they think about going forward is I feel like we've moved past the period of time where, the victim of a cyber attack can truly, fully, completely be an unaware victim and garner knee-jerk sympathy. The world is really become much more sophisticated in assessing, okay, maybe you got in the car accident and got hurt, but were you wearing your seatbelt? Were you drunk? Were you driving 30 miles over the speed limit? That it's not just, oh, you were in a car accident. My goodness, you were a victim. How horrible. Right. The world knows enough to ask questions to see what victims really did things the right way and were victimized anyway, in which case certainly all the help in the world should be available to them. But there are also enough victims who've kind of stuck their head in the sand and not done all that much. And, maybe they kind of had it coming.
Well, thank you guys both for being on here, Seth, Phil. This was a great introduction to cybersecurity issues, and you were a couple of great gents for coming on the show and being our first non-pure blood environmental professionals to be here. You set the bar pretty high. I'll remind everybody to check out Phil's podcast called The Sidebar. I know we poked a little fun at the beginning, but it's actually quite good. So give it a listen. Please reach out to me if you have any questions. Subscribe to this podcast as well while you're visiting Phil's, and we will talk to you next time. Thanks so much for listening.